Hardinges, and as Maggie has said, I lead the Data Institutions program at the ODI. Today, I'm really pleased to be hosting this session where we're going to be addressing the question of what can global scale technology companies or big tech do to support data collaboration. And I'm really pleased to have Jennifer Yokoyama of Microsoft and Ed Parsons of Google to join us for this session. And before we get started, I'll ask Jen and Ed to introduce themselves and their roles at their respective organizations. So Jen, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Yokoyama. I'm the Vice President and Chief IP Counsel here at Microsoft, coming to you from Redmond, Washington. So good morning and good evening to you in Europe. And thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here.
Great. And now to you, please, Ed. And I think you're slightly closer to home, aren't you? Or home for me.
Yeah, hi, good evening, everyone. Ed Parsons here, Google's Geospatial Technologist. I've been at Google since 2007, seems quite a long time now. Before that, I actually worked for Ordnance Survey here in the UK. So I've got some understanding of both the public and the private sector and the importance of data for both.
Thank you both. And for those watching, please do start to get your questions in for Jen and Ed in the chat window. We'll get to them before we break, which will be at 7 o'clock. So please do start to get those questions in. And so firstly, we've set ourselves a rather broad topic and session title here. So I'm interested first in what data collaboration means in this context to you, Jen and Ed, and your organizations. Do you see yourselves as merely providers of technology to enable others to share, collect, and use data? Do you see yourselves as significant publishers or sharers of data itself, or perhaps funders of new projects? And I mean, before I put too many words in your mouths, Jen, I'll go over to you first.
Sure, thanks. So actually, we see ourselves playing a role in all of those play spaces. We provide tools and technologies to help make data sharing easier. We provide data for collaborations that can help social initiatives. And we also provide funding for collaborations and certain initiatives that we feel need to be supported. You know, in the end, Microsoft's mission is to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. And that includes making our customers successful. And to do that, we have to offer infrastructure and tools for them to create value. And frankly, one critical way for customers to generate value is by realizing outcomes with their data. And that's why data is so important. You know, even today, COVID has shown us the value that can come from researchers and others sharing data to discover solutions faster than they could if they were to have to do it on their own. You know, this is a worldwide scale. You cannot do the things we've been able to do without proper and responsible data collaboration.
Great. And Ed, how about from a Google perspective?
I guess very, very similar perspective to that of Microsoft. I think, you know, we see our role as in many ways almost as an amplifier to take information, data that's out there on the internet specifically, and find ways of getting that information, that data into the hands of people who will find that useful. Now, that might be you or I as citizens traveling around London and wanting to find out what time, you know, the bus is going to arrive at the bus stop. It might be as particularly important at the moment, you know, if you're interested in epidemiology, getting access to health data sets. It really sort of focuses on the, you know, the core mission of Google, which was to find information, make that information accessible and useful to people. You know, as a teenager, I grew up being, you know, a hi-fi enthusiast, and I spent a lot of money buying an amplifier, and it's interesting what that thing does. You know, it takes a weak signal and makes it louder, and I think that's really one of the roles of the technology companies in this phase, to provide that amplification, take a relatively weak signal and get that data, in this case, into the hands of people who will find that useful. And you know, fundamentally, it's all about, you know, getting data into the hands of people who will find that information useful for whatever that particular task is.
I love that analogy, Ed. That's great. I mean, I think what you can do with data, no, it's awesome. Like, I think what you can do with data is you find these efficiencies and cost savings, like especially in industry collaborations, which I think are a little you know, harder because of, you know, people have issues or think there might be a competitive disadvantage there. But really what it does is amplify what you can do with data, and actually on some levels come up with certain things that you didn't know you could do. And someone from a different point of view can bring in a different use for the same kind of data sets by looking at it from a different point of view. The amplification is just a perfect way to describe it. I might steal it, so just full disclosure.
Oh, no, please do. Well, we're all about, open access to ideas and information here. And I think, the amplifier analogy works well as well, because at least when I was buying an amplifier all those years ago, you bought that separate to the record player, separate to the speakers. So, I suppose in tech speak, that was an ecosystem that you were building, and you didn't necessarily have to buy your turntable from the same people that you bought the speakers from. And I think that's, very much reflected on the way that we build applications and services today. In the terminology, they are loosely coupled, and it might be that your end user isn't aware that there are 5 or 6 different providers of data and value-added services giving you the piece of useful information.
Lovely, thanks both. And I think I'm keen to take us into some slightly more practical examples of kind of what that amplification looks like in practice. So Ed, I know you've worked a lot around the publication and sharing of mobility and mapping data. So perhaps some sort of concrete examples of what that looks like in practice and what those collaborations take the form of with others.
Yes, I mean, it's geospatial mapping technology is what I'm really mostly concerned with in my day-to-day job. But it's a broader area. We look across the many millions of data sets across the domains that are out there, and it's a big challenge finding those and making sense of them. Specifically around the geospatial information, particularly I guess related to the COVID outbreak. We were focused on mobility information, and this is information that we create from anonymous tracks of people moving around the world, and to use that as a data set that would then be valuable to decision makers in the public sector, mostly, to say, oh, well, how well are these various initiatives you're doing to sort of reduce movement? How well are they working? And it's an interesting case study because it takes a data set that clearly is going to be very valuable, but we need to go through all of those steps and processes to make sure that data maintains personal privacy. It's in a format that's useful to people. Do you make it available just as raw data? Do you make it available as an API? So for Google, an organization that there probably isn't that it's not really usually our mainstay of business actually creating data. We often usually point at data sets elsewhere. It was a good exercise to go through that process to say, okay, well, if we're going to make this information useful and usable to this end community while also maintaining privacy, what are the various steps that we need to take? And in some ways, we looked at it in the same way that we would any other product. You create a product management structure around that, and you put in place measures to see how successful that you're doing that. And I think that's an important insight. I think often we take that perspective that if you build it, they will come. If I just put some data out there, people will make use of it. But actually, there's a lot of work that you need to do to understand who the user community for that data set might be, to put it into a format, to make it accessible in a way that is going to be easily consumed by that particular community. How successful have we been? Well, I think reasonably so. It's something that the governments here in the UK and around the rest of the world are using as one of many, many measures to see how the various lockdowns that have been implemented are working. But another, I guess, key aspect of it is something that we are going to time limit. We see this as a data set that is valuable for this particular period of time, for this particular environment that we are living through, but it's not something that we want to see maintained after that. We think that there are issues with this ability persisting. So again, it's an interesting product management decision that you make to say, well, we're going to create this data set for this very specific purpose. Once that purpose has disappeared, we no longer need to create that data.
Perfect. Thank you, Ed, for that. And Jen, in the interest of disclosure and openness, we're working with you and the Microsoft team to support the Open Data campaign. So we definitely have a sneak peek into this, but perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about the campaign and the types of things that it involves Microsoft doing.
Absolutely. So in April, we launched an open data campaign really focused on helping to close the data divide to make it easier for organizations of all sizes to innovate with data and AI. And as part of that campaign, we committed to launching 20 data collaborations by 2022 to show the value that can come with sharing data. And I think Ed's point was a good one, which is, you can't just kind of put the data out there. It's not that, put the data out there and they will come. There are a lot of tools and things to think about around privacy, around who's going to use it. And that's why we adopted a principle that we would think to make data as open as possible. So within any given scenario, whether it's within a time frame, whether it is depending on who can share the data, that's really important to make these collaborations work. But we thought in order to know how they will work, to be able to show the outcomes and the success and the value that can be created from data sharing and data collaborations and opening your data as much as possible, we really needed to get into those collaborations. And that's what this campaign is really about. And one example we have is it just recently in September, we joined Allianz, Amazon, and S&P Global in the Climate Finance Foundation led by Linux, the Linux Foundation. And that's about empowering the investment community with open data to address climate-related risk and opportunity. We contributed corporate environmental indicator data to the effort, and we're going to see where that goes. And hopefully there will be great results to be able to show and share, how this can be done responsibly and in a way to really make an impact. And to cue off of your lead in, today we announced the new Education Data Challenge in partnership with the ODI that's going to look at the impact of digital access on COVID-19, on young students' education. We all know that this pandemic is taking a toll on students' ability to access face-to-face education. And we need to understand how and where the digital divide affects communities based on who has access and what type of access they have. So this challenge is to point participants to relevant open data sets that they can use to address this issue. And it includes new open data sets that are going to be made available when the challenge opens on December 10th. We as a company are contributing US broadband usage data. We are using differential privacy and applying it to that data to make sure that we're doing this responsibly, but also in a way that it can be useful and you can release these large data sets and kind of show that you can do data sharing in a trusted way. Additionally, we have another partner, Broadband Now, that's going to provide US broadband terrestrial provider data. So we're excited to see the solutions that come out of this challenge and really excited to be working with you on that.
Great, and I think one of the things that's come through in this discussion and also some of the other sessions today is the recognition that in response to COVID, we need to steward data in ways that perhaps we weren't doing before. I'm interested in your thoughts on whether the types of things that you're doing now, perhaps in particular to share data or to make data more widely available in response to the pandemic, whether those incentives and motivations will persist, hopefully when we begin to transition back or to a slightly different world, I should probably say.
I certainly hope so. And I think that, some of these technologies and tools that we're developing to help making sharing easier and more trusted, frankly, will definitely persist. Things like differential privacy, confidential computing. We're also doing things like the Peer Learning Network, which is also in collaboration with the ODI. Participants will receive funding, expert guidance, and technical expertise for their collaborations from the ODI and Microsoft. It's interesting because these are the types of things we're going to get learnings from people in the data community about how to manage trust environments and issues associated with trust and trustworthiness. Because I'm sure Ed's seen this, and I'll let him talk to it. But that there's really a resistance on a lot of fronts to opening and sharing data because of the trust issues. So we're hoping that through this peer learning network, we can answer questions such as, where privacy considerations are critical to sharing data, what are the governance and technology mechanisms that can be effective so that they can work outside of a pandemic in a world where that can move and help us move forward with tackling some social and economic issues that really everyone in the world could use the tools for.
I think that's absolutely right. I think the epidemic has really just shone the light on the best practices that we kind of knew were there before, but it's just made that I guess a little bit more obvious to us, and it's made it more obvious to society more broadly. There was kind of a joke earlier on this year that everyone was a closet epidemiologist. Now I think everyone's a closet data scientist, and those best practices around making your data discoverable, making sure that your data sets are as much as possible persistent, so they always are in the same place. The real focus on, I think, provenance has become something that perhaps more than anything else, the outbreak, the epidemic has highlighted for people. That need for good quality metadata, for understanding where the data has come from, understanding how that data has been collected, what its original purpose for collection was. So I think that's become, it was always important, perhaps it's become more important, probably because of the nature of the outbreak. Things like licensing, which is going to be and always is a big issue, has probably been less of a focus for people, but I think it remains, it persists something that's really important to understand. And then there are the very technical things about persistent identifiers and schemas that you might use. But I think it's been hardly say it's been good, but it's great that there's now much more understanding, more I suppose focus on this as a topic of just general conversation, and that helps us as an industry.
Thank you. And perhaps to change gear slightly, then I'm interested in your reflections on how your roles in the data ecosystem have changed over time, perhaps some of the barriers or challenges to this space, or how you interpreted this community and the open data world at the beginning, and how that might look now. How has it changed, if at all, and in what ways?
I would guess it's got bigger in terms of, clearly there is more data out there, and the volumes of data that we create on a day-by-day basis, clearly that was always going to be the case. But I think the other side of the equation is also interesting, in that perhaps once upon a time this was something that was interesting to very focused, specific domains in computer science or in the sciences. This is now expanding out to being a much broader ecosystem, and there are more I think business and service opportunities that are emerging. In many ways, what I guess Nigel Shadbolt and Tim Berners-Lee originally came up with the original kind of focus on open data was that understanding that this would provide different opportunities for businesses or for social enterprises to try to create new things. And I think that's the area where there's been the biggest change. And I think that's, again, linked to the earlier points we made, where the role of technology companies, the large technology platforms, is to provide the plumbing, the infrastructure for that ecosystem, to give people easy access to those many tens of thousands, billions, millions of data sets out there, to make it as easy as possible for you to be able to get access to up-to-date, useful information, and then build your end product on it in that disconnected way. I guess it's ended up being much more a reflection of the architecture of the web than perhaps we might have imagined once upon a time.
And Jen, how about yourself from a Microsoft perspective?
Yeah, I would second what Ed said. As we've seen how organizations think about sharing data and about open data throughout building this campaign and talking to people around the world about it. There are a lot of roadblocks. The three that come to mind are privacy concerns, safety concerns, and I would bucket those together. The thought that if an organization opens up or shares its data, that their competitors will use it against them. And simply, and this is, it's going to sound a little bit like a broken record, but Ed hit the nail on the head. Like, data sharing is difficult. It is not just, hey, here's a bunch of Excel sheets, go do some stuff with the data and come back with some great insights. It has to be usable. It has to be accessible. It has to be large enough so that you get meaningful, insights and data out of it. And those are not small things to tackle. And so, what we've really learned and what we're really trying to focus on is how do we address or make inroads in any of these roadblocks that we've been seeing. So for example, I mentioned data differential privacy, and that is a tool that can be used when there is sensitive data. It is very complex. It is not, you press a button, everything's got differential privacy and you figured it out. But it is a very good tool. And for those of you who don't know about it, you introduce relatively small inaccuracies or statistical noise to the data. They're large enough that they protect privacy, but small enough that the answers provided to the analysts and the researchers are still useful. So it's better than just anonymizing data. It actually makes it much more private, and it secures and protects that data. And it's as if the individual's information was never in there, but the data and the usefulness of it remains intact. Those are the types of things we're looking into. Confidential computing is one way to address the issue of competitors trying to take advantage of using your data, where you can post a data set in a confidential computing cloud and no one actually has access to the data itself, but they can run the algorithms and get the insights and the lessons from the data. And that was really a lesson we learned from the open source movement, where you can really share but build, where everyone really does benefit in the end from a properly governed and responsible data sharing platform.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think differential. Sorry, I was just going to say, I think that's actually right. Differential privacy is in some ways, a game changer when it comes to that, data sets that could have a privacy implication. But we shouldn't forget, that many of the data sets that we're talking about, much of the open scientific data has no, privacy concerns with it. And, we shouldn't hide behind privacy, as has happened a lot in the past to stop data sets being shared.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Ed. And that's what, it's funny. I always say people always forget that. And I forgot about it too. A lot of the data out there has no personally identifiable information or information that has competitive concerns. There's really a spectrum of data that you need to think about. And things like weather patterns that can be incredibly useful if they can be pulled and open in a way that is usable and easy to use for people who want to analyze it and research it. You can get so much value out of that on the climate change front and other places. And so to just stop it, I don't want to share my data, there's too many privacy issues, there's too many regulatory concerns, that's not really all we're talking about. And you really have to think of the whole world of data as along this spectrum. And frankly, it's why data and data sharing and open data is such a complex and really interesting subject. And I'm really happy to have partners like the ODI and to see people like Ed at Google doing this type of work, because it's really important. And I do think it's going to be a game changer if we can get it right.
Great, and I was actually going to try to pick up on that parallel between the open source movement and open data, but in the interest of time and the number of questions that I have coming in, I will save mine for another day. So a couple of questions that have come in around a similar theme, which is, do we think in the future that organizations such as your more competitive environment that you might find yourselves in is stewarding data in ways that drive public good or public value? Can you see yourselves as organizations competing on that and competing to be the best at unlocking that type of public rather than purely shareholder value from the data that you hold?
Well, we probably missed the middle of your question there.
Yeah, you cut out a little bit.
So, sorry about that. I'll repeat it. So I was just making the point that we have you both on the panel today, but you probably find yourselves as organizations in slightly more competitive ones outside of the ODI Summit. So I think some of the questions that we have coming in are asking the question of, do you see yourselves competing over things like how well you steward data for public good and for public benefit, and how readily you make data available to other actors? Is that some source of competition going forward?
I can imagine there will be competition in terms of who can build the best tools to share data, and I think then everyone benefits from that type of competition. I think the data sets that are published, most of us, I'm sure it's the case with Google, it's the case with Microsoft, we don't enter into exclusive arrangements to share open data. That's kind of not what we're doing, obviously. But if we can make tools that make it easy for people to access, where we can build tools that make it easy to make that information available on mobile devices or across networks, and we compete in terms of who makes it easiest to share data, I think then that's something that everyone benefits.
Yeah, and I agree. That's a win-win net, right? So a lot, and to your question about kind of social good, our open data campaign really was launched around our social good initiatives. Microsoft has a ton of them, and we really do think that data sharing and open data is the best way to tackle the big social and economic issues like climate change, accessibility, disaster response, justice reform, healthcare. These are the things that we really do think we should be following and using data to help tackle as a globe. We all need to get better at these things, and the more the merrier, the way I see it. And absolutely there'll be competition, but competition makes people better, right? And so I think that will help all boats rise. So hopefully, I think I messed up that metaphor. What is it? A rising tide helps all boats rise, and we think that's really what data is. It's not a zero-sum game.
Sure, and one of the other questions that's come in, I think, is related to this, is sort of who should decide and how what data is made available. So perhaps a way of framing that for you both is how do you understand and recognize that others would appreciate or see value in accessing data that you hold or that you collected, or would see value in having access to tools or software that you've developed? How do you engage with that community to understand what it is they need?
Well,
I think
start,
from a good, yes, Jen, please go first.
One of the other things we did as part of the open data campaign was we came up with 5 pillars, and one of those is empowering. And the point of that is to help organizations generate value from the data according to their choices, right? So they choose who to share with, how to share it, what the appropriate time frame might be, or something, or the parameters like that. And really use that to develop their AI talent, to use it effectively, data effectively and independently. And you need to be able to do that. And frankly, you need to start with the conversations to understand what you can get out of it, where the best bang for your buck is, as far as where do you want to put your data, who do you want to share it with, how do you want to share it, what type of environment, a trusted environment, is it a truly open environment, who you socialize it to, so that the right people, but not just all the same kind of people, realize that this is a data set that's available for analysis.
And Ed, apologies, I have to jump in as the clock is ticking down quickly. And so one last question for you both, and if you could respond with a sentence or two, that would be ideal. Is really looking forward in the spirit of the summit to the future and the future of data collaborations. What can you do, and what would you like to do as global scale technology companies to support data collaboration going forward? How will it look different to today?
You expect us to answer that very quickly in one sentence? I think we need to work hard on education, so we get a more knowledgeable community in its broadest sense that understands the value of data, and then how you turn data into information.
Yeah, I agree. I think it needs to be about the overcoming that initial hesitancy and resistance of organizations opening their data, and then doing that through education of how it can really create value, and really I hope everyone wants to be a data scientist. We need more data scientists. This hopefully will help get people excited about it and get them into this world where there's just so much that can be uncovered.
Perfect. Thank you both. I dropped off there, but I'm sure they were both very thoughtful and engaging answers.
We were
Back to
brilliant.
you, Maggie.